All right, everybody, welcome to the National Pork Board's webinar highlighting the output from the June 2024 Hogs and Pigs report. My name is Courtney Knupp. I'm the Vice President of International Marketing here at the National Pork Board. The National Pork Board is a producer-led organization that seeks collaboration with industry experts to distribute information that helps pig farmers in a wide array of business objectives. Due to some conflicts in the schedule, our original moderator, Gordon Spronk, was unable to join us, so you're stuck with me for the day. But today we will be hearing from two esteemed guests. First, Steve Meyer, Senior Economist with EverAg, as he gives his expert opinion on the recently released report. And then from Brett Stuart with Global AgriTrends, who will give an update on the global state of the industry. And we just really want to thank you all for joining us today. I need to talk quickly about antitrust. All the work that the National Pork Board does complies with the Sherman Act. The best rule is if you have questions whether a certain matter can be discussed, do clear it with an attorney first. I'll give you a few seconds to review the statement. This is our National Pork Board disclaimer. The pork checkoff funds are being used to host this webinar with the purpose of helping pork producers understand publicly available information. This webinar will be recorded for further distribution. The views expressed by the guest speakers are theirs and not those of the National Pork Board. And now I'm going to hand it over to the first expert, Steve Meyer, and take it away, Steve.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started here. You haven't had enough legalese today, so I guess I'll start out with some of that. EverAg is an introducing broker. We advise people on using futures and options. Those are risky investments. You need to be aware of that. And so anything that this is based on the best information we have available. And unfortunately, it's based on my mind, and that might be a problem, but it's an honest effort. So I want to put that up. The second one is along the antitrust lines. Nothing that I say here is intended to suggest output or pricing action by producers or packers, by me personally, by EverAg, or by the Pork Board or MPPC, who I serve as their consulting economist. My comments are strictly based on my opinion of what the market will cause to happen in the coming months and years. And all producers and packers should do individually what is in their best interest. Okay, next one. Let's get started here. My mantra for the past year has been this, and if you'll pull it on up, one or more of the three things must happen to return pork producers to profitability. Obviously, we had a horrible 2023, a combination of high costs and some disruption in marketplace and those kinds of things, mainly high costs. Caused us to certainly be in a pickle. We dropped off from the very high demand levels of 21 and 22, but to get us out of this fix, costs must fall or demand must increase, and that's either or both of domestic consumer level demand or export demand. And we're going to have Brett Stuart on a little bit to tell us about export demand, and I'm just going to touch on exports just real quickly, and he's going to give us a lot more details. Or supplies must be reduced. I mean, you can't get this thing back to profits unless costs go down and prices go up. And the second two things there are the way that you do that. Next slide, please. Here is the cost model that I have, and that says May 31st futures. I'm sorry I didn't change the date. That's based on futures as of last Friday's, June 21st. And the average corn futures price in for 24 in that for hogs sold in 24 was $4.51 per bushel. The average soybean meal price was $3.60, and it would have cost for this year in about the $86 range, down 11% from last year's record, but still by far way higher than we were in 2020 before corn and soybeans took off under the all the changes for energy policy that put a lot of value on soybean oil and drove up those prices. Those things are not coming down very fast. They moderated some. There is some, there's hope for a big crop and lower prices this year. There's also, it's the 27th day of June. There's also fear that it won't rain and we'll have higher prices. So this is kind of the best we can do. It's based on Iowa State University's estimates. But notice there's almost $20 per head of cost, higher costs in Iowa State's model now that weren't there 3 years ago. and that is non-feed variable costs, that's fixed costs, and I don't think those are going away. So we're going to have some high costs to deal with for some time. Next one, please. This is just a matrix of that model. The bolded numbers would be where we are today. Notice if we went down to $4 corn and $300 bean meal, though, we would still be just over $80 on cost. So there's not a lot of bottom side in this. The red numbers there would be what our cost would be now if corn and soybean meal were what they were in 2020 when we had $63 costs. So you can see that the world has changed on this. Could we go back? I think it's very unlikely because the cost of raising those crops has gone up dramatically. A lot of that depends on what happens in South America, but I think we have to pencil in mid-80s somewhere on cost for the foreseeable future. Next, please. Exports have been the real high point on the demand, and Brett's going to give you a lot of details. I just threw this in here to just make the point that demand is a combination for pork. For hogs is a function of demand for pork, and the demand for pork, of course, is international and domestic. And this international side has been very good through April. And Brett's going to give you details, so we won't spend too much time here when you got a real expert to talk to. Next one, please. If we look at domestic demand, this is pork real per capita expenditures. You can see our very high demand levels of 21 and 22. 23 was much more moderate, but back in the realm of the last 10 years. And that's kind of where we are today. If we go to the next slide, you can see this is a scatter diagram that shows kind of the same information. You can see very high domestic consumer level demand there in 21 and 22. Last year, we're back down in that pre-21 level. And this year, the X is so far the real price of pork, real retail price of pork this year. The vertical red line would be per capita availability based on our production forecast at the moment. And so we're kind of back in that pre-21 level. Now, is that bad? No, it's not bad. It's much better than we've seen in the past, but still, it's not as good as it was in those 2 years. Next one, please. Here's monthly. This is beef in the upper right, chicken lower right, pork in the lower left. We had a pretty good month in April, above last year. And I think we're going to run above last year probably for the next 3 or 4 months because last year was pretty bad. We had a pretty slow 3 or 4 months on domestic demand last year. We're still down about 3.8% for the year, but notice we're bouncing right around that 5-year average line. So that goes back and says, okay, remember the 5-year average here includes 20 and 21 in it. So again, I can't say that the demand has been bad. It's just not been as good as we were accustomed to there for a couple of years. And that's been somewhat of a drag on prices. Go to the next one. Here is the profitability model. This is back on March 1st. I presented to the pork board on March 1st. And futures at that time would have put in a $4.95 per head profit on our model. Now, this model, the cost in this model represent the low-cost 25% or so of producers. Average producers are probably $5 to $7 per hundredweight higher than that. So average producers are $10 to $12 worse on profit than this model says. But back on March 1st, you could lock in using the futures at the time. If your production parameters were similar to those represented by the Iowa state system, you could have locked in about a $5 bill per head. Next one, please. Here's where we were last week, a decided change. And so this thing has deteriorated mainly because of the sell-off in lean hog futures. Costs are just about the same as they were back in the first week of March, our estimates for 24 and 25. But lean hog futures have gone down pretty sharply. And so last week, minus $9 per head. That 25 that you see out there, that would be in at about minus 12 at this point. So that would put us with 3 years of minus 28, minus 9, and minus 12, and something's got to give here. Remember, I said, better demand, lower costs, fewer pigs. We haven't done much on cost. That's not really our doing, but that's the way it is. Demand has not perked back up to 20 and 21 levels, even though it's not terrible. And so far, we really haven't done much on supplies, and that's really what this Hogs and Pigs report tells us. Next one, please. And there is the report, the 24 report for June. You can see that the differences over on the right-hand side, Very few of them are over 1% from pre-report estimates, the average of pre-report estimates as published by Ernst & Berry, and the actual year-over-year percentages, very few over 1%. I would say this is an as expected hogs and pigs report. There just isn't much change. The one number that, I guess there's two, the breeding herd was down 1% more than what analysts expected and a little more than what I thought. I had it down a little more than what the average analyst guessed. And intentions, June, August intentions down 1.1%, where March, May intentions were up 1%. So that's kind of an odd deal. Farrowing intentions are a strange science, I think. So I don't try to get into them. Important one down at the bottom, pigs per litter. Analysts thought it would grow up by 2.3. I thought it would beat that just a little bit, and it only went up by 1.7. So a little bit of slowing in the efficiency, productive efficiency rate. We've been up 3% and 4% over the last year or so. If we go to the next one, this should show graphically, there's where the breeding herd is, just bouncing around the 6 million level. We were behind, we were lower than that in December, up a bit. I thought we would grow the breeding herd slightly as we went through this year and then be larger than the breeding herd as we get out to December. Right now, given the results of this report, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So we're going to kind of go sideways here. We're just over 6 million head. Farrowings down a bit, but commensurate with where the breeding herd is. Next one, please. We see the pig crop on the left. Again, we've been kind of level on this pig crop for quite some time in the U.S. It grew a little bit from 21 to 23, but then we dropped it back down a bit. If you look, pigs per litter, of course, just rocking along at record levels quarter after quarter. Now, the next comparison that we do will be with the good numbers last year. So I don't think we're going to keep this 1.5% plus up. We're probably going to fall back to about 1%, but we still have a sow herd that's growing in its genetic capabilities. One of the things is, can we get all our disease problems on hand? That kind of ebbs and flows to some degree. But right now we're doing a pretty good job on pigs per litter, much better than we were just a year and a half ago. Next, please. That gives us a slaughter forecast. Now, my slaughter forecasts are in the gray here, and they are they're based on this report. All of the other forecasts are based on the March report. Pardon me, this was the March report. This was my forecast from March. And notice I had 130.448 million, up 1.9%. If we go to the next one, it'll show you my forecast out of this one, 130.476. Hardly any change, 2% up. Some growth in the second half of the year caused by an extra, one of the drivers is an extra slaughter day in both quarters. And that accounts for about 1.5% of that growth, of that 3.3 and 3.4. Everyone else's forecast here, Iowa State, LMIC, and USDA, are pre-report estimates. I don't have their numbers coming out of this report. All I have is mine, but I thought I'd put those up there to still provide some kind of context for comparison here going forward. Next one, please. This would show my price forecast back based on the March 24 report. These were done a couple of weeks ago, and so I update those all during the quarter based on current market conditions. And I would have said, 91 to 93 for this quarter, 71 to 75 for the fourth quarter, 85 to 88 for the year last week before I had this information. If we go to the next one, you're going to see that those didn't change very much. The fourth quarter changed a bit. The annual didn't change much at all. The first quarter didn't change. I've got an 85, 89. I've now got data to project out to the second quarter. And just like the other slide that I showed you, these price forecasts are based on this data from the June Hogs and Pigs report. All of the ones of the others that are on here for comparison purposes are not. They're pre-report numbers. Next one, I think that might be it for me. It is. And so I'll look forward to Brett's comments and be back with you for questions afterwards if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Great information as always from Dr. Meyer. Appreciate that. So today I'm just going to give a run through here. You can go ahead and click through here. Topics, a little bit on the macro situation, global pork, and then we'll talk about U.S. pork. So let's start off here with this slide. Global meat prices, and this is the UN data. This is the weighted average price in all countries of these commodities. And what you can see there, of course, is the big commodity super cycle that we just went through, really exaggerated in the grains markets. Unfortunately for pork, it kind of missed the memo. You look at pork and it just did not get what the other commodities got there. But that big deflation has ended. And if you look at the last 5 months, all of these proteins are now turning higher again. Problem is grains has also turned a little bit higher, but that big spike in grains prices had a big impact here in America, and it had a big impact around the world. And it's really started to fuel somewhat of a global liquidation in the livestock sector around the world. And that same pain that we all felt from high prices was felt by farmers in Europe, farmers in Asia, poultry farmers, everyone felt that pain. And so it's taken a couple of years for this to work through the system, but we're starting to see something that could heighten global livestock supplies over the next couple of years. Next slide. The other impact of that has been the impact on the dollar. And this chart shows these currencies moving against the dollar. The dollar would be the zero axis. Now, this goes back to January 2021. So this is 2.5 years of movement against the dollar. But there's a couple of things that are very obvious on there, right? And one is the strong peso. The peso is out on its own. It's the only real positive currency over that time period. And why did it get so strong? Well, you got to realize US treasuries you can invest in and get a 4 to 5% return today. Mexican treasuries are 11%. And so they've been able to attract a lot of inbound investment into Mexico. They benefited from the nearshoring, and that began with the tariffs on China. A lot of companies sourcing materials into the US are much more comfortable having manufacturing in Mexico than China. It doesn't have to cross an ocean. It doesn't have to go through a shipping container system like that, the ports, and it doesn't carry the politics that we have now between the US and China. And so there's been a pretty good, robust build out in Mexican manufacturing. Also, Mexico has the one commodity that most countries don't right now, and that's labor. Now, you can see if you look at that Mexican peso on the far right and you squint a little bit, you can see that big drop, right? A 12% drop a month ago. And that was the election of the new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Now, President Sheinbaum is the first woman president in Mexico. She's the first Jewish president of Mexico. And her mother and father's families, neither are from Mexico. I think they're from Latvia and Bulgaria. Interesting, right? It's going to be a bit of a change and some interesting dynamics there. But she's with this Morena party, and the Morena party was really founded by AMLO, the prior Mexican president. And that party has some pretty radical ideas for Mexico. And a lot of those are some pretty sweeping changes to the Mexican Constitution. And so when she was elected, it kind of shook the global investors a little bit to see what is this Morena party and President Sheinbaum going to do in Mexico. And so it shook that peso down. Now, the peso you can see is down 12% from a month ago. If you look, ham prices are down about 6 cents from a month ago. Maybe not as bad as it could have been, but we may see some more pressure on those ham prices. That affects directly the price that those Mexican importers can pay for US hams. Down at the bottom, the Japanese yen, right? Down 34%. That's also a 34-year low. And so in Japan, it isn't just US meat that's a problem, it's everyone's meat, because over the last year, you can see that relationship hasn't changed a lot. The big shift was back in 2022. But that weak yen means that those Japanese importers and Japanese consumers have to spend more for overseas meat and poultry, and it will reduce the amount of consumption broadly of imported beef, pork, and poultry into Japan this year. Now, that's been difficult. I would say what we've seen just recently in Japan, they have mined away some of their frozen inventories. And I think we're going to see a better second half of the year in US pork to Japan than the first half, just because they are getting to the point where they're going to have to turn to imports. And the other big supplier, Europe, is not what they used to be. We'll talk about that more in a minute. All right, over to global swine and pork. And you can see on these two slides here, the sow herd, and this is pretty interesting. You can run this data, this USDA data, back to 1960. And what we've seen in the last 10 years, we've seen two major trend changes. One, the sow herd stabilized back around 2004-05 and quit growing. And over the last 10 years, the global sow herd's been in decline. Now, that big drop was Chinese ASF, you can see on the chart. And we don't have real good data on China or what happened with the herd, but we know it was a massive liquidation in China. The challenge is on the right, we know we can still make a lot of pork with fewer sows, but the reality is we've hit kind of a hinge point in history. 2014 is when global pork production stabilized. And if you look really close at 2025, it's starting to dip. Now, this is good news when we think about pricing, right? This means that supplies are tightening, which is positive for prices. The next chart here, I break this out by country. You can take a look and see there. This is the 4-year change through my estimate of 2025. I've got Canada down 1% in terms of pork production over 4 years, Brazil up 13%, the US up 2%, and Europe down 12%. And so the big story, obviously, is that drop in European pork production. We'll talk more about where that's headed as we get into the next section. The next slide here, I take these numbers and put them on a per cap basis just to show that big macro trend. So worldwide, there's about 28 pounds of chicken produced for every man, woman, and child on Earth. And that's very stable, you can see. For pork, 23.9 pounds, down 1% over 3 years. But look where it was back in 2013-14. It was above 25 pounds. And so that's what I'm talking about. This is somewhat of a long-term decline in global production per capita. And you can argue whether people aren't eating it because we're not producing it, or we're not producing it because people aren't paying for it. It's a chicken and an egg argument. But the trend change is pretty clear. There is less pork. And I would suggest that part of that, not all of it, but part of it is what I think we're going to see is a little smaller consumption in China for pork. Beef, the trend line continues down 4% over the last 3 years, down to 11.9 pounds. 25 is going to be even steeper. And so the real support we're going to see in these markets, I think, will be the beef markets next year. Cattle prices right now, feeder cattle, fed cattle, the 90% lean price, all at record highs today. They're all going to take another jump higher next year. Next slide, let's shift over and talk about some of these exporters and importers. So we'll start out here with this global slide. You can see the shift, the 3-year change, and the big story here, obviously, is Europe. 2 million ton decline in exports over 3 years. Now, the big run-up for Europe was into China. And fortunately for Europe, they went into liquidation at the same time Chinese demand collapsed. And so those two moved lockstep. But we have seen a massive shift in European pork supplies. And it isn't just to China. Europe's our main competitor in Japan, in Korea, in a number of other markets. But the real story there is Europe. Now, if you look at the next slide here, you can see those EU pork exports are down 5% year to date. I know USDA has a positive number for 2024 for pork exports. I haven't out of Europe. I think that decline is real. I think the pressure is pretty severe. And what's happened in Europe, it's a combination of a few things. The Russian invasion raised the cost of electricity and energy significantly for Europe. That has not yet resolved. European farmers are still paying very high utility bills. They've learned to ration energy. Also, the feed costs are much higher. But also, the Europeans have added a whole slew of regulations around animal welfare, climate policies. Some of these sustainability policies have had a real impact. And for a lot of countries, they're just beginning. You may have seen Denmark just put out a new directive on a carbon tax. So it's going to be charged to farmers beginning in 2030. Denmark has been very vocal. They're going to cut their livestock emissions 35% to meet their climate goals. Ireland is talking about liquidating as many as 200,000 dairy cows to meet their climate commitments. But these countries are truly on board with this climate at all cost agenda. And it will affect pork production and pork exports. There you can see those exports continue to decline. The EU Commission came out and said those EU pork exports, they forecast 1% a year decline over the next decade. And so the reality is the biggest pork exporter in the world has taken a big step back from the global markets. And that's going to continue to open doors for US pork in Brazil and Canada and others. So how do we compare to Europe? This next slide shows the hog price spread. So this is EU hogs less the US hog price. This is as apples to apples as I can make it. It's in a US dollars a hundredweight, US hog carcass equivalent. And you can see there that those European hogs are 16 bucks a hundredweight more in cost than US hogs. And that's typically the case outside of through 21, 22, and back in 14, 15, those were the exceptions. But generally, the US is more competitive at producing hogs than Europe. And these spreads today are pretty big spreads, and we're starting to see that appear in the global export markets. So next slide, let's shift over. I mentioned Brazil briefly. Take a look at Brazil. 2024, you can see Brazilian pork production is going to be just above 4.5 million tons. For reference, we're 12.7 in the US. Their exports are 1.5 million. We're about 3.3. Brazil's now exporting about half of what we do. And if you look closely at that chart, you can see Brazil doubled those exports in about 5 years. And so Brazil is getting more aggressive in the global markets. They're pushing on Mexico. They're exporting pork to Japan in small volumes. They've come out and self-declared as free of FMD without vaccination. Over the next year or two, they're going to be pushing for that approval from the World Organization for Animal Health to support that claim. But we are seeing more Brazilian pork. They're pushing into some of these markets. They have a low cost base. They're lacking in efficiency and productivity compared to the US and Europe and others. But I believe these trend lines are going to continue. You're going to see that production increase, and you're going to see Brazilian pork exports increase. Now, where are they growing to? If you flip the next chart, you can see here Brazilian pork exports Jan to May. This is the data we have for this year, up 2% from a year ago. But look at that big decline to China. China is their big market. It's their number one market. They're the number two supplier to China behind Europe. But big growth to the Philippines, some growth to Chile, which the US ships a lot of pork to, some growth to Japan. Those are some of our key markets where Brazil is growing. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Like you say, I think Brazil is going to be more aggressive and more competitive in these global markets going forward. All right, I just put one slide in here on China, which is unique for me, right? I spent a lot of time talking about China, but we got to look here, at least briefly, at what's going on in the China market. There's the roller coaster from African swine fever. Those prices are not normal. If you look long-term in China, a normal price would be 15 to 18 RMB. Now, those Chinese hog prices have put producers underwater for most of 3 years. They have been operating at financial losses for most of the last 3 years. In the last month, we've seen a 28% jump in the live hog price. It's kind of garnered some attention. The reality is this doesn't matter yet. And with that, the US still carries a 25% retaliation tariff by China. For this math to work, the number to watch for, if those Chinese hog prices hit 26 RMB and push up from there, that means that China could be turning to imported pork. But that little price spike we've seen, yeah, it's interesting, but it is nowhere near what would be needed to turn to the global markets for imported pork. And so if we see that go up to 23, 25, 28, then we start going, okay, we could start seeing some bigger orders by China. Over to US pork. So here I just dropped in, this is the Iowa State data, farrow to finish, showing cost of production and sales price. And there you can see the blue represents water, right? And so when you go underwater, you plug your nose. And when you come up, you take a big breath of air. And it's pretty seasonal. You can see the profits are made in the middle of summer. The losses accrue over the winter. The challenge is these last 2 years have been incredibly difficult. There wasn't much of a chance at all in 2023 to get a breath of oxygen. And 2024, it's going to be pretty limited as well. And those are some forecasts just based on where cost expectations look and where the lean hog futures put us. And so the reality is we're in a bit of a tough spot, and a lot of equity has been mined in this industry. And these profits appear to be, unless something changes, like Dr. Meyer said, these profits appear to be a little bit fleeting here going into the winter. This is going to lead to some more severe financial pressure over the winter if nothing changes, which could further exacerbate some deeper liquidation than we saw over the last year. One other topic I want to cover here a little bit is the Prop 12 debate. You can click here and see that. And I don't know if this is fair. You can see my bias here. This is the high cost of social guilt. And I truly believe that social guilt is one of the most powerful influences in our country today. And you want to have an influence, you make people feel guilty. And California Prop 12, you can see the interest groups push this agenda. You can phrase questions however you want on a ballot. And consumers may not realize what is really going on. And I believe that's what's happened in California. But this is some data from USDA that showed early this year, the cost of pork into California, the average price paid in California, is significantly higher than the similar prices in other states. Pork loins, these are the pork qualifying for Prop 12. This is fresh pork in the meat case. Loins up 41%. Across the board average was around 20%. So this is costing Californians about $320 million a year now for the same pork they bought before. And unfortunately, it's a big win for these interest groups. But what does this mean for us in terms of our supply and demand? And Dr. Meyer's talked about supply and demand. Go ahead and look at the next slide here. I'm going to walk through some math. So if you take US production plus imports minus exports and get to a net pork supply, that net pork supply is down 1.6% year to date. And that's really because of export growth. So if net supplies are down 1.6%, California historically was consuming around 13% of the net pork supply. Now, some reports out of California, some traders are suggesting we are moving half as much pork as we did before Prop 12 was implemented. Some data suggests those flows are down 20 to 30%. So if we just assume hypothetically that pork flows to California are down 25%, that equates to 3.3% of net pork supplies nationally. What that means the other 49 states have 3.3% more pork. Well, we net that 3.3% against the minus 1.6, which is where net supplies are. And the reality is, instead of having net pork supplies down 1.6%, we really have net pork supplies up 1.7% in the other 49 states. And I don't know if that makes sense or not. To me, that helps explain why the market feels like it does. And the reality is here, this is a supply and a demand problem. And what happens when you raise the cost of pork 20% in California with 38 million consumers, you reduce demand. And that demand problem in California becomes a supply problem in the other 49 states. And this isn't about, do we have enough pork to supply California? This is about the prices are so high, they're simply eating less. And so I think that's been an effect on our markets as well this year. Over to exports. It's been a good year. Exports last year were up 7%. We're up 9% this year. Those are two really good years. You can see my forecast, what I'm looking at as we go through the year. I think we're going to continue to pace above those year-ago levels. If you go to the next slide, you can see it by country. And it's not too hard to look at this chart and say, where's the growth coming from? Mexico is absolutely critical, right? And Japan, pretty stable. China, lower. Korea's up good, but I think we're starting to see some of that Korean volume slow down a little bit. The all others, look at the others market. Great growth. That was up 30% last year. It's going to be up probably over 20% this year. And that's just a whole host of countries that Europe is pulling back from and stepping back from. And so let's talk for a minute. I can't go through all these, but let's just look at Mexico. This next slide here, you can see the ham cutout versus hog prices on the left. Hams are a key driver of that cutout. If you run that with bellies, it doesn't look nearly as tight. Hams are a key driver. And so hams are important. Hams are the main product we're shipping south across the border. And we ship fresh bone-in hams to Mexico every day. Now that flow has gotten so big that it is now 10% of our entire production. 16% of our production goes to the rest of the world. 10% goes to Mexico. That's a big number. And it's something we need to watch very carefully. Now, how resilient is that market? If If you flip to the next slide, I think Mexico's pretty resilient right now. You can see hog prices. If we convert those Mexican prices dollar for dollar, you look at the historical relationship, we're usually a little more competitive. It ebbs and flows. We're in a decent spot right now, but based on that currency move, Mexican hog prices didn't just drop, the peso dropped. And so that's why we're narrowing right there. And so keep an eye on the peso, see where that goes. But Mexico's in a big drought. They've got expensive feed. It's going to be a difficult year for them this year. Prices are good. It looks like, at least for 2024, we're going to keep shipping and have another growth year to Mexico. But again, a new administration down there and a lot of things to keep an eye on. But Mexico is absolutely critical to our pricing and to our complex. Next slide, I'll just wrap it up here. Normal risks, right? There's always the risk of disease, of politics, of interest groups, of export restrictions. Those are normal risks. I think there's some good opportunities. U.S. pork remains very competitive globally. I showed you that spread against Europe. The EU pork faces some serious threats. I think they're going to see production declines continue over the next decade. Mexico now buying 10% of production. How resilient? I think we're okay. I think it's good demand, and I think we're going to hang in there. And so from that front, I think that 9% is a good number. That 9% export growth takes 2% off of our production numbers. And so I think exports are going to continue to be a tailwind. Current projections show hog farming losses beginning again this fall. September, October, based on where futures are, we're going to drop back below break even. And farmers obviously have reduced equity from a year ago. And so the real question to me, and that's what I wanted to see in the Hogs and Pigs report, will liquidation actually outpace productivity? And only time will tell, right? But I think it's going to take before it's not going to happen probably till the snow falls this fall that we start to see what are people really going to do, and can we right size, if that's the right word, right size what we need to balance profitability again. China's hog cycle's likely turned, but temper your optimism, at least for now. With that, I'll wrap it up. We'll open it up to any questions, right, Courtney?
Yeah, you got it. Well, first, I have to thank you both. You're always a wealth of knowledge, and you give us a lot to think about. The time and your expertise just really help our pig farmers better leverage this USDA data for use in their own businesses. One thing I do want to just open up the question, it's the topic of purchasing power on our consumers, inflation. I just read an article about how expensive a 4th of July barbecue is anticipated to be, for example. Can you guys speak about how that impacts pork and how it impacts the other proteins? Steve, in the domestic market, Brett, internationally, is it just a U.S. thing?
Well, I'll take number one is easy solution to that July 4th thing, serve pork loins. I mean, really easy solution. That you can't beat it anyway. So that's we've got that problem solved. The inflation situation is certainly, obviously, has been top of mind for quite a while. And for a while, we had enough wage growth that actually, we had some growth in real purchasing power. That's kind of deteriorated in the last year or so. Now, the good news is that inflation continues to go down. I mean, we're a long way from 8.9% now, and we're kind of trending down. The bad news is, of course, it's still well above the Fed's kind of target rate of 2%, which is pretty arbitrary, but normally you can live with that. And one of the points I'll make is, there are people, I've heard people say, well, we need to get these prices stabilized so they're not growing. That tends to not be very good. I mean, if we look historically, a little bit of inflation normally doesn't hurt us too badly. And if you think about it, if you're in a business and you buy a product for X dollars and you sell it for X plus 2%, sometime later at that growth rate per year, there's profit there. Okay, so it does support economic performance, but still we need to get it back in control. Now, the good thing is that food was the poster child for inflation at one time, and it's certainly come down. We're not at this point. And if we look at the components of the CPI, housing is still the big chunk of it right now, and that's really what's kind of contributing to this. So I think we're in better shape. Is it good? Well, we probably need to get wage growth going up again. This is still a pretty robust economy. We still have very low unemployment. Inflation is going down. It's not where we'd like it to be. I don't think you're going to see rate cuts this year because I don't think the Fed wants to be a stimulative of any sort to this economy because they're really concerned about inflation. And so, I don't know, Brett, we should have had 3 recessions by now, according to most people over the last 4 years. And we haven't had one yet. And that doesn't mean it won't come. And some good people in macroeconomics still think that we're probably heading for a recession because there's some negative things happening on the debt side that could certainly lead us to that. But I have to say, there's a lot of criticism of the Fed, but it seems to me like they've managed a bad situation pretty well here, especially with like $12 trillion more dollars in the economy. I mean, to have 3% plus inflation with that much more money floating around, it's still going to take some time to get that kind of wrung out of the economy.
Anything to add to that on the international scene?
Yeah, I mean, you look at inflation and prices and consumer stress. To me, it's incredible the resilience of U.S. consumers. Like Steve said, I've got a slide I use quite often. It shows that it's a Bloomberg article that says 100% of economists predict recession within the next 12 months. That was October 2022. And I would guess in October 2023, it would have been the same. And yet here we sit. And I look at those retail prices. Retail prices are phenomenal. They're very good. We're averaging 30% higher what people are paying for retail pork than they were in the 5 years before COVID. 30%. And so consumers are kind of hanging in. There's no doubt there's rising stress levels with consumers, persistent interest rates, high housing costs, all of those things add up. But boy, it's hard to bet against the resiliency of this U.S. economy and U.S. consumers with money. Overseas, a little different story. There's some pressure here and there. The Chinese economy is still, I think, in tough shape. Japan's economy is difficult right now. I think some of those things will weigh on the market, but they're not new. They're things that are priced in. And to Steve's comment, yeah, you can live cheap on pork loins. And I'm a guy that grew up on a cattle ranch, and I buy a lot more pork than I buy beef. And we've raised pigs, and we usually raise a spare with our show pigs. So we're eating freezer pigs. But I'll tell you, I look at those loins in the store that are an inch or a half an inch thick, and I challenge anyone to cook one of those without overcooking it.
Yeah.
You have to be a ninja to be able to cook one of those without overdoing it. And I know there's challenges, a lot of different things we can talk about there, but if you can buy those full loins or half loins and cut them an inch and a half thick, and you still have to work really careful, but boy, they are a great option. So I hope there's wonderful weather and fantastic barbecues and people smoking pork all over the country here over the next month.
I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Thanks for being a good customer, by the way.
Yeah.
A couple questions coming in. One, we have a list of hot topics in the news that could impact our business. And the first one is tariffs, namely what China may be looking into in the European Union when it comes to pork. Can you guys speak to just how tariffs could impact our business, and specifically to that situation, what it could mean for U.S. exports?
I'm going to let Brett take that one.
Sure, I'll take a whack at that one.
At least start on it.
Yeah, so this is the story. Europe has announced they're going to put 38% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. China flipped out and said, that's it. We're launching a dumping investigation on EU pork. We want company-specific data, and that's where we sit. Now, dumping investigations are difficult. They take a lot of time. It'll be 12 months, maybe 18 months before anything happens. This does not mean a ban on European pork to China. It means potential dumping tariffs. Now, those tariffs could be 100%, they could be 20%. They'll probably be different for every exporting company. So what we'll see is some punitive tariffs put on Europe. Europe will consume what they can, they'll export what they can't consume, and that may come at a cost depending on how that plays out. It also will depend on where this Chinese hog cycle is, because right now Chinese demand is not that great. They're not looking for a lot of imported pork. But if that does heat up, if that Chinese hog cycle heats up, and we see prices start to rally into the end of this year, and they put duties on EU pork, then that could be very, very interesting for US pork. And even if they don't, the EU pork supplies of the past are not there. Those EU pork exports dropped 23% last year. And so if we see any type of Chinese rally or Chinese demand for global pork, it's going to have an impact. That EU story, that dumping case is going to be a long, drawn out story. Maybe not affecting us too much.
Impending port strikes. These have had huge impacts on our logistic capabilities in the past on behalf of the United States, specifically our exports. We may have another one looming here. Can you speak to your thoughts on this potential forecast and what we should be watching for in the pork industry?
That sounds like your question too.
Now explain that again. I didn't quite catch exactly what the question was. Sorry.
The question is especially looking ahead, potential port strikes. They've had impact on our business in the past. What would that mean if they happen again in the near future?
Okay, I thought it was pork, not port. I thought, what's going on here? Did I miss something? Yeah, port strikes are always scary, right? And a huge proportion of our pork goes out of these West Coast ports. We went through that volatility here a while ago, and they worked it out and straightened things out. But there are some risks now in the Gulf ports and the East Coast ports. There's talks of strikes, and I guess that's somewhat of this constant risk out there. Historically, you would say we really haven't been twisted in a knot over port strikes. That isn't to say it can't happen, but we've got to. It feels like our governments, our state governments, our federal governments are pretty good at making sure those don't become super disruptive, and maybe that's just hope, but I hope that's the case and we don't end up with further disruptions.
And let's remember too, Brett, that of the 26% of our production that's exported, 10 of that goes to Mexico across the border.
Right.
Okay. So, the ports are going to affect, 50-60% of our total exports. And as Brett pointed out, it's not 100% West Coast, but it's a lot. So,
yeah.
Steve, a couple questions on specificity in the numbers for this report. One from the chat is, are the higher weekly sow slaughter in 2024, is that reflected in this report?
I think it is. That's the reason that the actual breeding herd number that we see here is a little lower than what I thought, and a little lower than what the analysts thought. So I believe it is. Now, the question on that is, does that represent exits of sows, or are they depop repops? We're pretty sure that the surge of sow slaughter back in January and February didn't really change the sow herd, because we think that those were depop repops. The last month or so, 2 months, there's been a bit of a surge again. And the $64 question here is, are those depop repops, or are they serious conversations between producers and their lenders, given the deterioration of this product profitability outlook for this year and next? We don't know the answer to that yet. I haven't heard a lot about that, but as far as the financial stress, but we know it's there. There are producers that have gone down, that their working capital and those kinds of things are very, very tight. And now, if you look out, if you passed on taking $5 a head on the futures market back in March, and now you're looking at -10, I would think that wouldn't be terribly popular with your lender if you're in kind of dire straits. I saw some data last week that, the average working capital per sow in the Compeer system has gone down significantly over the last year or so. And in fact, the first quarter, the average of their clients was only $112, 712 versus the critical level of 600. Okay, so that's getting pretty close for the average to be at the critical level that you see producers at. So we think there has to be some real serious conversations going on with lending institutions, and that may be attributable, or that may be the reason for this recent surge in sow slaughter. And if so, then that would show up as liquidation and a smaller breeding herd going forward instead of growth. I thought we would grow it kind of a bit quarter to quarter all year, remaining below last year until December. This result would say maybe that's not the case.
And Steve, with the recent devastating flooding in Minnesota, South Dakota, Northwest Iowa, a lot of concern and multiple questions in the chat here about its impact on production, our inputs. Can you speak to what you think will be the result of these events this last week?
Well, the impacts on production will probably be short term. I mean, I know we probably had some finishing barns and a few hog operations affected, but the thing about floods is they only affect the low-lying areas, and so it's a pretty limited geographic spread. I happened to be at Lake Okoboji last weekend, and there was water everywhere, and had a heck of a time getting home out of there because of flooding on the Little Sioux River. So I saw some of this firsthand. But again, we need to remember that floods themselves don't affect very many acres. Now, the conditions that lead to floods can affect a lot of acres because it's going to rain. And if you in Southwest Minnesota and Northwest Iowa, there's a lot of water standing everywhere. They have had a tough time getting their crops planted. Those crops look not very good. I mean, they're certainly way behind. And now we're at the end of June. There's not a lot of options here. Now, again, the same thing needs to apply when we think about it in terms of a national crop. Those are important production areas, but they're not the entire state of Illinois or the entire state of Iowa. I mean, it will have some impact, no question about that. But that's part of what's getting reflected in these futures markets for corn and soybean meal at present time, is the difficulty that we've had in some important areas getting planted. If you drive get very far south of Spencer, Iowa, going south though, it really looks good. And the bottomlands of the Missouri River look great. I drove through a good chunk of Iowa last week and down the western side of Iowa, and it really looks terrible in Northwest Iowa and Southwest Minnesota, but it looks very good in some other spots.
Yeah, question on capacity for you all that's coming through. I mean, this is a big week. There will be a close of major Iowa, the Perry plant. What is the impact predicted for the rest of 2024, realizing we're losing some shackle space?
Well, it certainly is going to reduce our throughput capacity. There's two things working in our favor. A few plants have kind of tweaked some things and increased their throughput rates. And we get an extra day in both the third and fourth quarter. And I mean, that's not a small deal. And so that in effect helps increase your capacity for those quarters, for those time periods. And so those are going to help, but we're still going to be tight on capacity, and especially on barrel and gilt capacity. Our sow plants have plenty of capacity to run more sows than what they do. And there's slack there, but on the barrel and gilt side, we're going to be very tight. In fact, my estimate of 5.4 workday per week capacity versus slaughter for the fourth quarter is that we're going to be above that number every week. Okay. Now you say, well, we got holidays. Yeah, but the holidays you don't have the capacity because you're automatically taking a day off. Okay. So I think we're going to be very tight as we were last fall. So I could see a lot of pressure on negotiated hog prices again this fall. And that's not good news for anybody, but it's certainly going to be tight. And the closure at Perry, it did not dramatically make it worse, but it certainly did make it worse. And I think it's going to be a tough situation for a few weeks this fall.
Excellent. Well, with that, we have more questions, but we'll get back to those that did submit some as a follow-up. I want to keep us on time. I again want to thank our experts so much for being here with us today, especially you, Steve Meyer, because you have a big milestone in your life coming up, and upon retirement, you're greatly missed. So thank you for your service to our producers in our industry. And Brett, you have to continue working with us for a long time to come.
Well, I can tell you, I will not feel the same without Steve's picture on this box right here. Steve, and I echo the sentiment of the industry. Thank you. Your influence and your calm mind and your ability to analyze and communicate this information to the industry has been so valuable over the years, and just wish you all the best in your retirement. And hope our paths cross and we continue to see you once in a while here.
Well, thank you very much. Those are very kind words. It's been my pleasure.
And I'd also just like to, in closing, say thank you to you, our pork producers, for all that you do every day on your farms. You know, on behalf of myself and the rest of staff at National Pork Board, it's just an honor to work on your behalf, to add trust, to build value, and to make sure we're putting your checkoff dollars to work each and every day. And we are your resource and proud to be here for our industry. Just again, this quarterly report and the commentary, they're a snapshot of the industry as it is today, and it's a benchmark for quarters to come. We'll continue to provide these resources. Sign up for our newsletters. You can see everything that we're working on, from foreign animal disease, sustainability, and demand efforts at the National Pork Board. And again, just thanks for joining us today. And this will be available via recording soon. Have a great one. Thank you.